At various university campuses in the U.S. have been demonstrating against the ongoing military bombardment of Gaza. The protest, started by pro-Palestinian demonstrations, has spread into other campuses, and the demonstrations have in recent days turned violent, with riot police being called in to clear the encampments. And we've been joined by our correspondent there in New York, Jody Jacobs, who we can go back to right now to find out exactly what the latest developments are. Jody, so you've kind of basically painted a picture of what's been happening in terms of recent developments. How tense is the situation at the moment?
It remains very tense. I mean, of course, at Columbia University, which is sort of seen as the sort of epicenter of these protests, police, of course, moved in there earlier this week. They've now removed those encampments. Those protests are now taking place outside of the actual campus at Columbia University. But we are seeing this, of course, spreading to many other universities, not only in New York, but across the United States. Many of these are, of course, what we call sort of Ivy League institutions. And so these student protests are really continuing in that sense and remains very tense. These protests ultimately are sort of in solidarity with the people of Gaza, but the core demand of these students over the past couple of weeks has been that universities withdraw investment funds from what they describe as companies that are profiting from Israel's war in Gaza, and that ultimately is the core of their sort of protest. There seems to be this continuing dissentment at these higher education institutions in the United States as these protests, of course, take place almost on a daily basis here in New York and in other parts. An indication, perhaps, of the growing number of young people in this particular country voicing their concern around the government's support or the continued support for Israel as thousands of people continue to die in Gaza.
Yeah, and Jody, does it appear as though these various parties will eventually come to some sort of agreement at some point?
It's very difficult to tell at this stage, with students, of course, pushing these institutions to disinvest from these companies profiting from Israel's war in Gaza. But some say it's sort of that fine balancing act, because these institutions still, in some way or another, need to still continue their work. And it is one that is extremely difficult for these institutions to outrightly commit to. However, these students are pushing their sort of message. They're saying that they will continue their actions. What is very concerning from these student protesters, of course, is that you have authorities like the New York City Mayor, Eric Adams, who said that he was asked by the administrative staff at Columbia University to send in the city police to remove them off campus. The mayor, of course, insisting, and it seems to be that sort of message that is going around at other institutions, that there is a large majority of these protesters who are not university students, and that there seems to be these outsiders. So Eric Adams, for example, the New York mayor, is saying that he has intelligence that about 40% of those who participated in the protest at Columbia University were in fact outsiders, and this has raised concerns, and that is why the police were in fact called in.
Jody, if my memory serves me correct, you were in South Africa during the Fees Must Fall protests. Are there any comparisons that we can draw between these two protests?
Indeed, they are. And I must also add here that there's a large sort of solidarity movement with South Africa in this instance. The student protest at Columbia and at CUNY, which is the City University of New York, they've been very clear. They've sort of tried to manage their message. They're not speaking to all journalists. They are fearful that their story and their messaging is going to somewhat be distorted, because there is also the sense within certain media camps within the US that these protests are anti-Semitic and that they are not in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And so when you move in there and you say that you're from South Africa, there's sort of this welcoming response that you get as a journalist, because they see South Africa as this beacon of sort of international sort of being the compass of morality in the world in some way, following South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ. But the parallels that can be drawn here is that these student protests are very clear, and that they are moving towards, in the same way that fees must fall students had. They had a very clear message, and their power was in the numbers, and their power was to sway the opinion of certain lawmakers. It's a very difficult one, of course, very different in the United States as lawmakers here, some seeing it as anti-Semitic protests, others sort of not wanting to necessarily show their support. But these students say that with their numbers and with their increased sort of protests, they are hoping that they can sway opinion, especially here in the United States. I must also add that there was one student that I spoke to, and it's going to be very interesting as to how this plays out in the coming months, especially with the US now going to elections, and Joe Biden and Donald Trump trying to get to become the president of the United States this year. One student I spoke to said to me, especially here in New York, which is a democratic state, she said that the way in which the Biden administration has repeatedly ignored this sort of student base and what they are calling for is incredibly irresponsible. And she says that if there is a Trump presidency in November, it will be entirely on the shoulders of the Democratic Party for continuing to disregard its constituents, and a large base of that constituents sits here in the state of New York. And they are saying that if the Biden administration doesn't change its ways in sort of trying to support them and to not support Israel, it's going to be a very interesting election coming November here in the United States.
All right. Thank you very much, Jody, for your time. And that, of course, was our news correspondent, Jody Jacobs, joining us from New York.